non-governmental organizations. It has served on the boards of American Rivers, a Michigan chapter of Nature Conservancy, and currently serves on the Great Lakes Advisory Board for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. He's a fellow American Association of Advancement of Science and a 2009 recipient of the Award of Excellence of the Society for Freshwater Science. Please join me in welcoming David Allan.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group. I think Healing Our Waters is a very important and very marvelous group of individuals who are doing so much to benefit the Great Lakes. I thought just, the first thing I should say, though, is to recognize that this is September 11th, kind of a solemn day, and just want to recognize that this is the 13th year since the events that we all remember occurred in 9/11 of 2001. So I'm going to talk today about the many values of the Great Lakes, and is this thing advance? Yes, it does. And so I thought I'd start out with kind of a roadmap to the talk and the takeaway messages. So I'm going to do a little bit of refreshing for you some prior work that we reported on in a previous Howe conference, where we looked at multiple stressors across the Great Lakes. And one of the themes of that work was to recognize that there's not just one or a few, but really many stressors, and they vary from place to place. And if you think about what are the ways we go about prioritizing restoration, I think recognizing the variety of stressors and their spatial variation, their spatial location, is really important. They say when you're buying a home, the three most important things are location, location, location. I think when you're doing restoration work, having a notion of the location where various stressors are acting is terribly important. So that's a starting point for us. We then, in our work with the Great Lakes Environmental Assessment and Mapping Project, we call ourselves Project GLEAM, we went on to try to look at the human benefits, or in ecological jargon, the ecosystem services. And I'm going to give kind of an overview of some of the valuation issues. I am not an economist. I'm not even sure I know enough to be dangerous as an economist, but I want to give you a sense of how ecologists think about the values of the Great Lakes and some of the methods that have been used to date, and describe some of the new work that we've done that I'm quite excited about, where we've tried to bring our mapping approaches using GIS to look at a wide range of ecosystem services. And I guess if there's a theme to this talk, it's our project's focus on understanding the geographic or spatial range of stressors, and we'd argue the services or human benefits as well. And I'd also suggest that perhaps in determining where to do our restoration work, we may intuitively think about the places that provide the most benefits or the most values, but we may not very explicitly think about that, and perhaps mapping of benefits along with mapping of stressors could help us target restoration investments. So I'm going to quickly review the work we did on stressors. This is a collection of 8 broad categories of stressors: invasive species, climate change, toxic chemicals, and so on. I've indicated which of those are a priority under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Some are not explicitly called out under the GLRI. And those 8 categories, or sometimes you see 5 categories, they're familiar to all of us. But what I also wanted to emphasize is that every one of those is an umbrella. Climate change manifests itself in multiple ways, in winterized or summer warm temperatures, or spring runoff from river systems. Coastal development includes shoreline hardening and harbors and individual piers and docks and breakwaters. Toxic chemicals, there's hundreds that we pay attention to and thousands that we don't. So these are all pretty much umbrellas. When we set out to do our stressor analysis, we actually tried to break it down to what we thought were the stressors that were manageable to collect data about. And we came up with a wish list of 50. We had a working group of academics and NGO people who were very helpful in developing those ideas. And I'm going to show you a complicated chart just to make a general point. We ran a survey. Some of you may have suffered through this very long and detailed survey to ask people which of these were highly important and where. And what this is 50 surveys, 50 stressors. We had, I think, 8 different in the aquatic habitat category. We had 5 or 6 we called out within climate. We had a handful of fisheries stressors. So again, the point that there's multiple stressors out there, and they differ in perceived importance. These are rankings that some of you, about 140 people, I believe, put on these. So the message of multiple stressors, we use this information to put a quantitative value on the relative importance of different stressors, which we also mapped. And we only mapped 34 of these stressors because of data challenges. But what we did is we developed 34 individual maps for stressors, their presence, their incidence across the Great Lakes, and then we just weighted them by how important people thought they were. So to develop our cumulative stress analysis, we developed maps of individual stressors. We took a weight for the individual stressor. We multiplied them together and added them up. And that resulted in a product that we published about a year ago, which is a cumulative stress map based on 34 stressors in 7 of those 8 categories across the lakes. And I think it probably corresponds to what you'd expect to see, but it also, I think, has a process behind it, a methodology behind it, and it can be zoomed in. The actual data are plotted as 1 kilometer cells or 1 kilometer pixels, so one can zoom in to a particular area. And what we found was that in any one of those 1 kilometer cells, there were somewhere between 12 and 18 stressors that would have a value that was greater than 0. And so it reinforced this notion that there were multiple stressors, that there's spatial variance in those stressors. And so having completed that work, and sort of this is prelude to what I mostly want to talk about today, having completed that work, we wanted to ask, could we do something similar with the way in which people benefit from the lakes? Can we compare the stressors to the benefits? And that led us into some additional mapping information, but it also, I think, sets the stage for the main body of what I'll be talking about, which is how one might go about quantifying the values or benefits of the Great Lakes. And I'm going to begin with a little bit of general information on this. So I went to different sources that said something about the value of the Great Lakes and just compiled the ones I could find. And so here's some individual numbers. If you know of some others that I've missed, I'd be delighted to hear about them. There's birding and shipping and commercial fishery and jobs, a variety of ways of coming up with these measures. And I think if you ask what they have in common, their total values, and that's often what people ask for. What's the overall value of the Great Lakes? What's the single number? There's no spatial resolution. Our value is greater in one place than another, and they're also pretty uncertain. In fact, most of these numbers are generated at the request of essentially an industry, the shipping industry, the fishing industry, or the conservation industry, and they essentially commission an accounting firm to come up with a number, and frankly, they probably want the biggest number that they can justify because they're demonstrating the value of that which they care about. They're probably also pretty good numbers. I don't doubt that. They don't, by and large, show up in journals of economics. They're not peer-reviewed literature. They're essentially commissioned accounting estimates. Nonetheless, they reinforce what we clearly, I think, all appreciate, the considerable value of the Great Lakes. When I talk to people who really are economists, what they tell me is that what's really more important than these total value numbers is some kind of a marginal cost-benefit analysis. What's the additional benefit that we would gain if the lakes were cleaner? What's the actual loss to us if the lakes are polluted. So it's often considered a better measure than total value. And you can think of it as what an individual would pay for an increment, for an additional day of fishing or for a day of fishing that was, in that angler's view, a better and more successful day. And a great example of this, and another widely quoted economic analysis, is the one that the Brookings Institute did, where they said, what is the return on the investment in restoration? And by a variety of methods, I think good methods, but again, huge uncertainty because there's not a lot of data to go on, they came up with this, I think, pretty well-known number. If we put $26 billion into restoring the Great Lakes, we get back long-term benefits of at least $50 billion and short-term benefits of an additional amount. So I think that was a wow number that was the kind of thing that helps us understand why we need to invest in restoring the Great Lakes. What ecologists tend to talk about, they like to call ecosystem services. And they define these as the benefits that humans derive from healthy ecosystems. And they typically put them in these four broad categories. I think any ecology course in the country, at any college in the country, would have a lecture on this topic with that definition, with those four categories. Supporting services that basically underlie everything else, provisioning services, the stuff we actually tend to harvest, food, water, commercial fish, the regulating services that might have to do with water quality, climate regulation, and the cultural services that include spiritual enrichment, recreation, and aesthetic experiences. This is a widely used categorization among ecologists. I contrast that across the top with, again, a list that might be familiar to many of you. This is what one also sees in many lectures on valuing nature, on ecosystem services, the direct use values, the indirect use values, the non-use values, and sometimes the option value for future use. And we're most comfortable when we're over there on the direct use and consumptive use side of the categories, and where the value is actually set through a market exchange. So we know what people pay for a fish on the dock, or we know what people pay for raw timber or finished timber. A lot of what is happening today is efforts to find ways to quantify some of these indirect use values and some of these non-use values. And so there's a growing activity in the academic community and the ecosystem services community to find ways to try to quantify these. A recent book by Peter Kariva. Peter's known to some of you as the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy, has been a leader in this field, and their Natural Capital Project is really making a lot of good progress along this line. So I want to use this sort of broad introduction of ecosystem services and valuation measures as sort of a framework for maybe discussion of what it means to put a value on the Great Lakes. And I also want to then move directly into some of the work that we've done, attempting to look at, actually we're on the direct use value side of that chart, and we've looked at commercial fishing, and we've looked at a variety of recreation uses, cultural uses, and attempted to quantify their spatial extent. I should tell you at the outset that we don't put a dollar value on, let's say, beach use, but we put a relative use value. So rather than just knowing there's a beach somewhere, we also have some information about how that beach is used relative to other beaches. And the idea behind our work then is to try to find ways to show graphically the range of ecosystem services that many of us put forward as the things that are the reasons we want to protect the Great Lakes and how they vary from place to place. So these are ones that we've spent a lot of time thinking about, and the ones that show up with circles around them are the ones that are going to be in my presentation today. We haven't taken on shipping, one of the most valued services of the Great Lakes. Obviously important, not necessarily dependent on the health of the Great Lakes, Power plants, likewise, the heaviest user of water by far. They have some ecological issues if they get clogging by mussels or the like, but by and large, not that dependent on the quality of the Great Lake. Drinking water, if there's time, I'll come back to that at the end. It's hard to quantify drinking water, and when it comes right down to it, you don't pay much. You pay, I just pulled a number off an EPA website yesterday. You pay about $2 for 1,000 gallons of water. On average in this country, and the average household pays about $300 for their water use. And so if you go out and buy one bottle of water at $1.50, it doesn't take you very long to spend more money on a bottle of water a day than your household uses in a year. So these are the issues that I wanted to bring up. They're the research questions that we've attempted to address. We often talk about ecosystem services as a justification for everything we do on the assumption that they're there and they're there everywhere and they're really important. So are they similar everywhere? Are they really important everywhere? If you're getting one service at a location, do they tend to cluster? Do you get a lot of services at that location, or are they independent of one another? Can we find any relationship to conventional economic measures that would reassure us that these ecosystem services actually have real dollar value? And then finally, in a bit of a provocative way, I want to come back to this question of, can we use stress and services together, or stress and benefits together, as a way to think about where our efforts should be devoted? So to answer the first question, it was basically, for me, this was the fun part of the project. I get excited when I talk about this. How do you map data on beaches or birding or boating or topics like that? Sometimes the data is out there and easy to grab. Most of it you have to figure out some way. So I'm going to give you some examples of some of the challenges, and again, you might have ideas that would help us do any aspect of this better. So first question, by the way, we do US and Canada. That was which added its challenges, but we felt was necessary. So beaches. You can find in US and Canadian databases 1,277 public access beaches with a lat long. With the power of unlimited student labor, we go and look at everything on Google Earth. Sometimes you'd find a beach that was on the shore of Lake Superior that was like 2 kilometers from where the nearest 2-track ended, and no sign of any infrastructure. And anyone using that beach? Probably not. It's not delivering a benefit. People don't use it. A beach that no one goes to doesn't count. So we had to figure out how those beaches were used, and we had a couple of filters that we used. So there's monitoring by states in the province of Ontario, and we figure if they're monitoring a beach, if they're spending money to keep track of water quality, then somebody somewhere cares about that beach. It's used. We basically took the monitored beaches and those within major parks or national seashores, and we had 874 beaches, but there's still no good visitation data. So some clever people in the Natural Capital Project have been experimenting with using Flickr photos, geocached photos. And they have an algorithm for photo uploads, and they've got some very good evidence that there's a strong correlation between the number of Flickr photo uploads for a park site and the number of people who visit it, where they have actual visitation data. So we counted geotagged photos within 500 meters of the centroid of each beach using an established published model. So this is crowdsourced data, kind of interesting ways of getting information, social media data. And we also looked at beach action days. I'm not going to talk about that. And I hope this shows up. Can you see red dots versus blue dots all right? Is it clear enough? So the dots are beaches, and the color coding is in quintiles. So the lowest 20%, the next 20%, to the highest 20%. So what you see is locations where there's a lot of beach visitation. So this is a relative measure of beach use. It's not dollars, but and it's not even actually number of people, but it is a relative measure of how heavily used those beaches are. I think it corresponds to common sense, and it tells you that it's not the same everywhere. And that's actually going to be repeated in each slide that I show you. Birding. Where do people go birding? Well, here we used citizen science data, and actually one of our co-authors is in the audience, Patrick Doran of the Nature Conservancy, was instrumental in pointing us in the right direction. As birders have gotten more plugged into to using the internet, now there's a central place, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which registers what are called hotspots, and they don't just take any place as a hotspot, they vet them, and then other birders can upload their birding observations there, and you get a count of how many birders go to these places and where these hotspots are. 180,000 visitors, 1,500 sites, mapped across the Great Lakes, again, point locations, and you can see places where there's heavy birding and places where there's not so much. And in fact, the pattern's already starting to show up. However wonderful the north shore of Lake Superior is, and I think it's pretty wonderful, it's not necessarily a place where there's a lot of people going to beaches or a lot of people going birding. Boating, we wanted to quantify boating, and we used a variety of sources of data, and then we looked at the relationship between those different sources of data to reassure ourselves that we kind of understood what was going on. In the end, we used the location of marinas and the number of boat slips at a marina for an indication of some marinas have 500 boats, some have 20 boats. There's a different use there. And then we used boat ramps, and often there's information on parking places at boat ramps, and if there weren't, we get the students to go out there with Google Earth and count parking places, or work out a statistical relationship between parking lot size and parking places. And so we were able to quantify both marinas and boat launches, and pretty similar looking pattern, starting to be some consistency here. Parks, okay, finally here we just have to get the numbers from the Canadian and US Park Services. In this case, the data were available, 43 million visitors per year to 144 parks. Big caveat, these are the parks that you and I might drive to, Saugatuck Dunes State Park or Sleeping Bear or whatever. This is not Grant Park in Chicago. This is not a downtown park in Cleveland. We don't have data on those, and that's something that we want to be clear about. But if you look at park use, now it's pretty scattered. It's pretty, you know, it's a little more destination-y in the look. Sports fishing, we use angler hours. I always like to say it's not called catching, it's called fishing. And so angler hours is the measure of how much activity is going on. And we were able to, from different agencies, get the number of angler hours for both private boats and charter boats. And you hear a lot about charter boat fishing, and I'm all for supporting the charter boat industry, but you know, 91% of the fishing hours are private boats. And that's consistent with other people. So there's a lot of private boat fishing out there. And you know, the economics of charter fishing is sort of a whole interesting story by itself. These data are reported in what the agencies call statistical districts, so they're larger and coarser. Sport fishing is on your left, and charter fishing is on your right. And places that are shaded in gray is where there's no data, which doesn't mean there's no fishing, but it means that there's probably not enough fishing for the agencies to invest in doing surveys. So it's probably a low value, is probably the real value there. And then finally, commercial fishing. There's a lot of available data on catch in grid cells across the lake. We had to go out on our own to get port landings. And so we got port landings around the lakes. And in some places, we weren't able to get port landings for a variety of reasons, including privacy reasons. And so we just get an aggregate value for a county rather than a port. And so this is commercial fishing distribution. On the left is the port landings, and on the right are those places where we had to aggregate data by county. And most commercial fishing is in Canada compared to the US. Lake Erie is the largest source of commercial fishing in all the Great Lakes, and the dots pretty much bear that out. So there we are. We've looked at 5 recreational services and 1 provisioning service, commercial fish harvest, and we've simply mapped them to get an idea of their spatial distribution. So the next question is essentially overlap. If you get service X at a location, you also get Y, Z, A, B, and C. To aggregate the data, we did it by county. It's the only practical way for us to aggregate our data. So what we did is we created what I like to call a county ribbon. We went 5 kilometers in the land, 5 kilometers into the water. We just make a ribbon, a polygon in GIS terms for each county. And then we add up the amount of fishing that's within that county, or the amount of beach use that's within that county. And we're able to do that for both the US and Canada. And what you see, I don't know if you're able to see it well enough just by squinting, but you can see some differences. The top 2 charts, commercial fishing and sports fishing, don't look very similar. That's actually pretty much Canada-US difference, and then within US policy. So that's no big surprise. Some other things look like there's a lot of stuff going on along the shore of Lake Erie. A lot of stuff going along the shore of Lake Erie. So we approach that with some simple statistical approaches. So we just run a correlation of the amount of boating within a county versus the amount of park use within a county, or birding. And what we find is that most of these services are correlated, except commercial fishing doesn't correlate with anything. But all the recreational services tend to correlate, not perfectly, but there's certainly evidence that if there's birding at in a particular county, that there's people using that county's services for boating, for beach use, for fishing, and so on. So yes, services are correlated. And then we took one more sort of look at this, and now we added all our services together. So we gave them equal weight, scaled them 0 to 1, so they had equal weight, and added them up. And so now we asked the question, if we were to look at all of our services together and their pattern across the Great Lakes, using county ribbons to look at it, what kind of spatial pattern would we find? And this is, again, one of our core messages is the spatial variation. Some counties deliver a lot of services, some not so much. Of the services we measure, obviously, of the services we measure. Another reason that we did this particular form of summing of the data by county is that's how economic data are available. So there's county level data for jobs in all the sectors that the Bureau of Labor Statistics and others report. And various people have used that information to try to evaluate the Great Lakes. One of the biggest number on the chart that I showed you early on was a Sea Grant project that added up all of what they viewed as the Great Lakes related industries by county. And then they totaled it for the total value of the Great Lakes in dollars and jobs. NOAA has had a team of economists working on this for a couple of years, and I like what they do. They have a narrower set of what they view as industries that are actually related to the Great Lakes, that depend on the Great Lakes. And then they break the data down by the shore-adjacent zip code. And explain why that's important is that these methods would assume that every hotel visit in a county that borders the Great Lakes benefits from the Great Lakes. Bit of an assumption. By doing it by zip codes, at least you get a little closer, but you're still assuming that every hotel visit or every restaurant visit in the zip code alongside the Great Lakes somehow benefits from the Great Lakes. We wanted to see how that economic data compared to our service data. So here's what the economic data look like from NOAA, and we just zeroed in on tourism and recreation and our 5 measures of tourism and recreation. So these are Bureau of Labor Statistics, Census Bureau data, and so on, again, compiled by others. And if you take this information by county and map it, so this is purely mapping NOAA's coastal economic data, again, you see spatial differences. You see some counties where there's a lot of tourism and recreation and some where there's not so much. And that, I don't think, should be a huge surprise. The GDP of tourism, I think it's 2010, for all, and by the way, at this point, we draw back to US only. We couldn't get these data for Canada. The GDP for shore-adjacent counties is about $8 billion. For tourism and recreation, number of employees, 282,000. I think a substantial number. And we simply asked, how does this correlate with what we measure? And so by various both pairwise and multiple regression approaches, if you care about the details, the answer is yes. There's a strong statistical relationship between the spatial variation, the county-to-county variation, in what we call ecosystem services and what shows up as tourism and recreation GDP and Bureau of Labor Statistics. So reassuring to us, I think reassuring that the ecosystem services that we are quantifying are related to real dollar values. The last thing that we did is we went back to our stressor work. So this is our stressor map again, and it shows the spatial variation of these stressors. And so we went back to these data and we said, okay, let's make a county ribbon map from this. Let's pull out the average stressor value for each county. And now for each county, we've got an average stressor value and an average service value. And it looks like this. Need to stare at it for a minute. The service delivery value is on the vertical axis. The stress is on the horizontal axis. There's 105 counties bordering the US side of the Great Lakes. And there's some pattern there. Up in the top right, those red squares, oh, the legend is left off, pardon me. The red squares are Lake Erie. So Lake Erie tends to occupy the high stress, high benefit part of the map. The purple dots are mostly Lake Superior, tends to occupy the low stress, low service part of the map. And just as a provocative exercise, because I think this is not nearly refined enough to be ready for prime time, you could argue that those places that are suffering a lot of stress but deliver a lot of benefits could be our restoration priorities. If we're not getting much service, should we be spending our restoration dollars there? If these places are high benefits but low stress, maybe we leave them alone, or we protect them, and low stress, low benefit, maybe we leave them alone. So again, a very sort of crude first approximation of asking the question, if we use stressors and services together, would it help us think about where we should do restoration? So I'm going to quickly wrap up with some takeaway messages. Yes, I think ecosystem services are everywhere, but they're not necessarily the same everywhere. So there are locations where we get more benefit from the lakes versus less, or we're getting different services. And this is probably intuitively apparent to people who are working in a particular location and advocating for protection of a particular resource, but perhaps as we do lake-wide or basin-wide planning, we can use mapping tools to do this more systematically. Cultural services, actually college is kind of like wetlands and carbon sequestration and water purification and nutrient cycling and stuff like that. But actually what most people think about when they think about the benefits of the Great Lakes is fishing and boating and park use and birding and so on. And these recreational activities do vary from place to place, and they do correlate well with standard economic metrics, and one can find these different combinations. I wanted to close with the very important caveat, what are we missing? Lots. We're missing lots. This is not a comprehensive analysis. I tried to, with those photos, also capture some of those things we're missing. Water for municipal, industrial, and agricultural use. We have not quantified. It's hard to quantify. Municipal use water actually doesn't cost very much to deliver it. Gets really, really important when you don't have it, like Toledo experienced recently, but otherwise, cheap and take it for granted. Cooling of power plants is a valuable service, property values, nature viewing, and then all the intrinsic values of a healthy ecosystem. And here I just wanted to give a brief shout out to Nature Conservancy's lake-by-lake biodiversity conservation strategies, because they do provide a spatially detailed analysis and information about the important biodiversity values we find around the lakes. And that might be very important in places where people aren't fishing or boating or recreating, but nonetheless powerful rationale for continuing to protect those areas. And then intrinsic values, future use. These are very hard to measure. I took this chart from a recent Blue accounting document. I thought it was just a lovely way to sum everything up. the point of it all. Ecosystems support human uses that provides societal values that motivate investment in protecting ecosystems. We get a lot of help from a lot of people, financial help from the Herb Foundation and the Water Center. We get terrific cooperation from data providers, data sharing, and we do our best. We work hard to share our data back with others, and that's been one of the gratifying aspects of our work. The services study, which is a manuscript we're working on, has multiple co-authors. So there we go. I hope that provided some ways of thinking about ecosystems services and the values of the Great Lakes that will be helpful to you in future deliberations. Thank you very much. Nobody told me if we take questions, but I see hands up, so I guess we take questions. All right, the gentleman was first, and then I see Dave Ulrich after that. Sir? In the greenish shirt. You, please. Yeah, there's a microphone. That'll help me.
I was curious, what you mentioned zip code distance from Lakeshore.
Say a little louder, please.
You mentioned by zip code what was your definition of a lakeshore community? What was the distance?
The definition of a lakeshore unit for us. So it's a spatial unit, and in fact those ribbons I showed you are as much for data visualization as for anything else, but they also allow us to aggregate our data in a convenient way. So we simply, in all our work, we set a landward boundary of 5 kilometers. So we only took birding sites that were within 5 kilometers of the lake boundary. We tried to weight park visits that were lake adjacent, so that was a way to say this is something that is close enough to the lake that the lake matters, and then 5 kilometers into the water to capture the distance of the majority of sports and commercial fishing. Sport fishing, not commercial fishing.
So I'm thinking of communities like this, and I live in Rochester, New York, which is a distance from the lake, if that was taken into consideration. So,
you know, there's surely value to the Great Lakes that extends further from shore. Further from the water's edge, and there are ways to quantify that. But we were looking at and so people who would do economic analysis of beach use, for example, would use travel distance or travel time as a way to try to quantify a value of how far away people are coming from, and that'd be an alternative method that would perhaps get at what you're asking.
Thank you, David. Not to be too parochial, but being a daily visitor almost of Grant Park in Chicago, I thought I heard you say that you didn't use data on park usage in urban areas, and if I heard that right, I'd be interested in knowing why not.
Well, simply difficulty of acquiring the data
Really?
Because we would want to know not just how many people visited Grant Park, but how many people visited every tiny little city park that was within 5 kilometers of the lake in US and Canada. In other words, to be consistent, we would need data of that nature. And that, you know, no one collects that data and makes it available, so one has to figure out, is there some way to acquire that, and a sampling program could be designed. But no, we simply, in many things that we do, candidly, we hit a place where nobody's collecting that information. There's no easy way to imagine how to come up with a proxy for it, and so we would not be able to use those smaller parks, but we would, for example, Chicago's an outlier in all of our data. It's actually an outlier that correlates, but you almost have points here, and then here's Cook County, you know, in terms of everything. So there, I think one would be drawn towards doing case studies of a few locations to try to understand that better.
Yeah, I would think that at least the larger cities would have some pretty good data on park usage. I know a lot of our cities have data certainly on beach usage, and I'm sure there's some correlation. If in the future you need help in getting that data, I would be happy to do that.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, one of the values of sharing this information is people have good ideas for things that we haven't figured out how to do yet. So I appreciate that, Dave. Thanks.
Hey, Dave. First, in case you had suspicions, Dave Ulrich has something to do with cities. Not just something to do with cities, but some other places too. This is terrific work. It's really exciting work, and it's a huge build out from the stressor maps that you've done and that we presented before, and it really provides some real management suggestions and options as you pointed out. And it's one thing to know where the stresses are, but it's another thing to know, okay, this is where the benefits are, and therefore when you match those up, how do you make actual investment decisions? You and I have talked about the challenge of once you have something on a map, even if there are caveats as to the completeness of the data, people tend to look at the map and not all the caveats. And so even with the benefits map, do you have plans to build out some of the other data pieces, not just some more of the intrinsic use data that Dave was talking about in terms of park use and the like, but we've talked before about some of the nature services pieces. So are there places where it's actually more important for a whole lake for restoration to occur, not just because it benefits that area, but larger pieces? The biodiversity pieces from the Nature Conservancy. I mean, my suspicion is that there actually are data, or that you could develop data somehow that would indicate where those locations are, even though they don't match the intrinsic use values that are already there. So the question is, can we perfect this a little more so that when someone sees the map and says, aha, that upper right-hand quadrant, that's where we need to invest most of our restoration dollars, that's actually a decision that doesn't need caveats.
Yeah. No, thanks for that question, Andy. And Andy was a collaborator on the stressor work, so he's been a big help all the way along in thinking about this. We started out with the whole basin approach with both the stressor work and the service work, and one of the pieces we're pursuing going forward, and some people in this room are helping us with it, is to see if we can be more effective in our approach if we go down to the level of an individual lake. And so we've actually formed a sub-project looking at Lake Erie, trying to combine. The original goal, sort of interesting to mention, of the group was to try to combine the stressor work, the service work, and the actual management activity, because many of us, I think, have looked at the GLRI's maps of their activities and think, well, can we also see what's being done where, so we can feed that into our discussion and try to use it in whole lake planning. So that's something we're attempting to do. We're at early stages. Some skepticism and pushback about the ability to really capture the whole range of management activity that's out there, and GLRI is probably a small fraction of it. Whether we can do something that would actually help a LAMP, that's what we would like to do, and we're talking to LAMP people who are very kindly helping us think about it, but that would be an ambition and aspiration of this work, and ultimately to feed into an effort by not just us, but there's lots of other people out there who are gathering spatial data, doing GIS mapping in the Great Lakes, and so what we need is for all of this to come together in a way that supports the thought process and decision process that goes into lake scale planning. And some people want to go right down to plot scale planning, and that's all that hierarchy of scale is part of the discussion and part of the challenge.
Thank you very much for the presentation, first of all. Second of all, is the web address where you might find this information that's listed on the bottom of the slide?
So the Great Lakes Mapping website has all of our stressor information on it. It does not yet have our services or benefit information.
Okay. And I guess the other thing, in watching your data, it seemed like, obviously, but statistically also, there's a huge correlation. I like the stressor benefit idea, but there's a huge correlation between population. I mean, you could almost predict the stressor and the benefit by population. Is that an accurate statement?
It is, and thank you for bringing that up, and I'll just briefly comment on it, because it led us to wonder, well, should we somehow normalize, divide through by population, somehow try to take population out of the equation? And they said, well, that doesn't make sense, really, I don't feel, because the whole point of benefits is people are enjoying those benefits, so it's kind of an obvious finding that where there are more people, you're seeing more benefits. What might be a little bit counterintuitive is, you know, poor Lake Erie gets a bad rap in a lot of places, and well, Lake Erie is providing a lot of benefits. And so you can have a lot of stress, but you can still deliver a lot of services, and access of people to locations, I think, is a big part of it. We ran some other analyses to see what else might be explanatory, and you get some additional explanation out of second homes. So you sort of get this notion of people, again, it's kind of a no-brainer, where people live and then where people like to go to recreate tend to correlate pretty well with the data. So good observation, thank you. Yeah, Joel.
David, in the 07 Brookings work, one of the metrics they used to sum up the valuations was property values, pre and post restoration activities. And you mentioned that that was excluded from your study here. And I'm wondering if you can just comment on the merit of property value for those zip codes or approximate to the stressed areas that you're looking at, and if you see that as a place where that does make sense to add in as a service, given that that tax base is such an important part of what drives decision making in those communities.
So I'm a bit reluctant to offer an opinion on that. I think that's better to have somebody who understands economics much better than I do to respond to that. There's clearly, and I think this was maybe a point I wanted to make in my opening remarks, there's a lot of different ways to come up with valuation numbers. And they make different assumptions. If you're using the kinds of GDP statistics, what you decide to pick out of that, what you think is relevant to the Great Lakes. So I think all the studies are valid. They just have their own set of assumptions. And probably most of them don't take that marginal benefit approach, which the Austin study did do, and say, if you do restoration, then will you benefit, which is much more relevant than, you know, how many dollars are coming in at a location. But how well property values reflect that, I don't feel qualified to say, sorry. Well, I think I've worn you out. Oh, no, not quite.
Do I get a second one,
You
David?
do. Dave gets a second one.
I really like this analysis, and of course it is of significant value in the work that we're doing together. But I do have a little bit of a concern. You know, if you take the stressors and the benefits, and I didn't look as closely at the benefits as I should have, but the stressors, Lake Ontario is bright red, even more than Lake Erie. And I guess as a distinguished academic and economist, what would you advise Congressman Benishek and the congressman in the North Shore of Lake Superior to say to their constituents why no GLRI money is going up there because you're a purple dot or whatever it is? How do you, these are the geographic distribution political realities. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, on the stressor side, I guess all I can say there is you know, you recognize and celebrate that Lake Superior is the word pristine is probably never completely accurate, but the least altered, the most pristine, has the most intact food web. It's a system that needs to be valued to keep it as much as we can and not have it look like Lake Ontario. And so every reason to prevent degradation. And on the services side, I think there is a case to be made that if restoration is really about trying to improve what people gain from the lake, then we should, we should pay attention to the places where people are deriving the most benefit. And there's multiple next steps of which stressors are most important, which stressors are actually manageable, reversible. And we are doing some work on that, but it's still clearly academic investigation.
Just out of curiosity, if I might, I know one of the great concerns up around Lake Superior is the potential for significantly more mining. Did this work factor in, if you will, potential stressors, or was it just ongoing or historic?
So no potential stressors were involved. So there's no Asian carp because we can't map the Asian carp. Again, the maps themselves have to represent actual current distribution. In the survey, we tried to direct people to the present. We don't want future threat. We don't want a past threat. We want to know what those threats are. So it's intended to be current, and therefore, important caveat, it says nothing about what the Asian carp could do or what mines around Lake Superior could do.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Probably a good time for people to go home. Thank you very much.